A very good evening to all. I would like to welcome you to Drishtikon 2.2 Session 3. On the behalf of Center for Disability Research and Training, Kirodimal College, University of Delhi, I would like to welcome Priyam Sinha, PhD Research Scholar, National University of Singapore, who would be taking the Day 3 session with us. The topic of her lecture is Disability and Sexuality. Over to you, Priyam.
Thank you so much, Mansi, and welcome all of you for today's session. I would be discussing about disability and sexuality. And while we would be touching upon a lot of the topics that were as themes outlined in the last two lectures as well, I also want you to keep in mind that this is a frame of reference where you need to look at certain films and view them and interpret them, thinking along the lines of how certain theories have been developed, written about, and interpreted. So this just provides a lens of reference in that concern. For any clarifications, concerns, or questions that you might have, feel free by the end or in the chat box itself to keep noting down your questions, and we will keep addressing them as well through the session. So I would like to start off with today's session, which is, as Mansi mentioned, on disability and sexuality. I hope my slides are visible to all of you.
Yes, Priyam. Yeah.
Okay. So the session titled Disability and Sexuality. I bring about these theoretical understandings of the discourse on disability and sexuality. So the recap of the previous session that we had was on what is this idea of the norm, the ableist imaginary, the constructivism of who becomes the ideal and therefore who becomes the constructed anomaly. There were also understandings of how deafness and femininity, blindness and femininity, deafness and masculinity, blindness and masculinity have been also weaved within cinematic narratives. At the same time, the in-betweenness of something called coda was also conceptually discussed in terms of the film Khamoshi. Now, these ideas of disability highlight these elements of how disability is viewed as something that needs to be fixed or that needs to be cured. But at the same time, it mediates one to think along the lines of what is the myth of the perfect body. And therefore, the entire understanding of what is the role played by Bollywood in crafting this dialogue. Now, when we look into this discourse on sexuality and disability, there are many theoretical understandings of it. And also cinema has also tapped into this dialogue in certain ways or the other. Now, as we move on, we'll be discussing some of these scenes that have been crafted within disability cinema in Bollywood. Now, situating this dialogue on disability and sexuality also means to look into the idea of compulsory able-bodiedness and the heterosexuality. Now, narrative processes is something that we've been discussing about all through the session so far. And this is something that has been an underlying thought within crafting, characterization, stylization of disability and disability characteristics in cinema. So moving on to the basic understanding, there has also been a lot of work that has underlined how disability and sexuality have been seen as incongruent identities. Robert McCruer was the key figure who actually situated this dialogue on how media cultures also popularize this narrative of how disability and sexuality are considered as incongruent. Now, within the Indian cinematic context, Joyajit Pal has particularly written about physical disability and Indian cinema. And particularly, Meenu Bhambani has written about the Bollywood portrayals of women with disabilities. While we look into this, what she states is a doubly marginalized position. There is also an overarching generalization of how the compulsory bodies basically means being heterosexual and being able-bodied, which is something Alison Kaffer talks about. Now, a dialogue on this sexual culture, the ideas of understanding and interpreting one's own sexuality and being recognized as a sexual being becomes this underlying thought of studying sexuality within disability studies itself. So this taboo topic of discussion brings me to a question that I would like to ask all of you. For how many of us was the idea of sex education very crucial, or even the dialogue on sexuality very normal within households? Can anyone answer this question? Anyone from the audience?
Yeah, so I don't think anybody actually spoke about it at home. It was an unwanted topic and unnecessary and shouldn't be discussed. It wasn't a family, it wasn't a family-oriented topic, like how we say family movies or a family show. So this wasn't a family topic.
Thank you so much, Akshita. So yes, that is something, like it wasn't a family type of a discussion. It wasn't a discussion that you can comfortably express about. And that itself adds to the silence, the vulnerability of discussing any form of sexual disillusionment. Now, while we look into this taboo topic of discussion, which is sexuality, Annie Finger states that sexuality is often the source of our deepest oppression. It is also often the source of our deepest pain. It's easier to talk about and formulate strategies for changing discrimination in employment, education, and housing than it is to talk about our exclusion from sexuality and reproduction. So as much as one may want to talk about how liberated the societies are, how much of a taboo topic it is, the idea of sexuality has always remained very intrinsic to one's own perception of self and identity. But this is the one topic that is also not openly discussed about. So Robert McRuer basically writes that these dialogues on disability and sexuality are even more complicated with a multiple layers. They are considered as incongruent. Now, there are prejudices, stigma, framing, and perceptions of disability itself. One of them being that people with disability are incapable of being considered as sexual beings or having sexual urges. Rather, they are expected to repress their sexual urges. The other being an assumption of asexuality. Now, even other disability rights scholars have critically argued that be it literature, cinema, or even these popularized histories and mythological characterizations do not really touch upon this sexuality of the disabled character. And at the same time, this freakish association, which Rosemary Garland Thompson talks about, is always associated with adding to the misfitting characterization of a person with disability. So a person with disability is perceived as someone who is an abnormal and also is oversexed or hypersexual. Now, these are all prejudices and these stigmas and framing of disability that permeate into creating a supercrip phenomenon that is popularized within media cultures. Now, there are other assumptions that base the ground for all of these ideas coming into framing of disability in cinema. One of them being sexual hygiene. Now, the assumption that people with disability have lower sexual hygiene. Now, this is something that even Renu Adlakha talks about. that the idea of sexuality, sexual urges, sexual hygiene is always considered as disassociated from the idea of people with disability. Now, this aversion towards looking at sexual variation itself becomes the basis of this entire stigmatized understanding. At the same time, the queer and the disability are perceived as these disruptive sexualities, something that adds to the situated otherness. Now, when we look into these aspects of sexual hierarchization, we see the subordinate position that has been allocated to the people with disability. So another question to all of you, is disability portrayed as desirable in Bollywood cinema based on whatever you have observed so far?
Hi.
No. Hey. Hello.
May I?
Disability in Bollywood cinema is usually not just they are portrayed as asexual. They are portrayed as not needing or even requiring a romantic relationship or a sexual relationship, and that they are unfit or incapable of being in one.
Definitely. So something about romantic relationships and disability, unfit, yes. So these misfitting characterizations become very prominent within disability cinema. Somnath, you were also saying something? Did we have another response? Okay. So I see some responses in the chat box. There is so much of inhibition to start a conversation on sex education. So true. So these parameters basically come into play when we talk about sex and disability. Now, what are the basic fundamental ideas that when we discuss about disability and within disability studies that become a lot more prominent for the kind of access to discussing about sex, sexuality, and sexual culture? One of them itself becomes access. The second becomes agency. Now, agency in itself becomes being recognized as a sexual being and having agency over one's own body and bodily integrity. Now, these ideas of repression, that is, you cannot be presented in this particular way in public, and the restrictions that are imposed due to society and what are the norms and what are preconceived notions or prejudices, add to this private and public divide. Now, what is this private-public divide? Essentially, that you are confining the person with disability within settings that deny the form of access to actually nurture oneself as a capable being, almost creating this barrier or segregated society. Now, when we look into these assumptions, prejudices, and these cultures of disableism in itself, there is this constant element of fear that becomes very dominant. The fear basically stems from the fear of abuse. Abuse in itself has multiple binaries within it, because when we talk about abuse, it's not just a fear of physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, all of which are also damaging. Now, these elements come into play and they add to this culture of victimization and infantilization. So the dialogue on disability and sexuality has so many multiple layers that it adds to this entire public-private divide wherein the person with disability is often considered as the other or an outlier. Now, situating this dialogue of disability within the cultures of able-bodiedness and heterosexuality adds to a lot of these stereotypical classifications, wherein disability is seen as token representation in Bollywood cinema, also with underlying forms of how disability is subjected to pity, pathos, mockery, to be laughed at, or even segregated from the society itself. Now, certain films in this regard will also outline this culture of disableism, because there are many fragments to this understanding of disability itself, which is curated and crafted within media portrayals. So, disability as punishment. Disability as punishment has remained very dominant within Bollywood cinema and its crafting, with films like Sholay and many such, where the association of disability has always meant that you are paying for the sins of the past life or for whatever you have done before. Disability as tragic, or the demonized portrayal of disability. Now, that idea also goes with how the song, music, and its characterization enables the dialogue on how the disabled life is seen as a life worse than death, something that Anita Ghai talks about, that these elements of portraying the disability dialogue are never really doing the justice that the disability studies person would want. Now, disability as revenge. The understanding of disability is also seen as leading a life almost like a life worse than death. Now, when we look into these elements of freakish association that Rosemary Garland talks about, the ideas of disability as being misfitting, these elements become a lot more prominent. Disability as disequilibrium, disability as disfigurement, disability as redemption. So if you have committed a sin, the idea of feeling good about yourself becomes helping out a person with disability, and then you become the heroic figure. A film like Black, in a way, taps into these sentimentalities of how disability as redemption becomes how the idea of masquerading disability becomes the crucial element in cinematic representation. Disability as dependence, and that is another prominent element within disability studies, wherein the idea of disability is always seen as infantilized characterization. Disability as hopelessness, or even unmarriageable in a lot of these characterizations. Disability as mockery, and disability as pitied. Now, well, these are many crafted ideas, and there could be a lot more theorizations of understanding disability and its cinematic representation. This can never be a limiting factor. These are only certain ideas that come across within very prominent themes on disability scholarship and how the dialogue on sexuality has been created within them. So as I mentioned, a film like Sholay becomes very pivotal in this regard, as it puts across this dialogue of disability being as a sense of revenge among the two protagonists, wherein Gabbar intervenes in order to cut off the arms. So I would now play this scene, which actually highlights this element of how Gabbar Singh cuts the hands of Thakur in order to give him a sin and lead a life that is now worse than death.
अभी तक बहुत जान बाकी है तेरे हाथों में। अब मैं तुझे जान से नहीं मारता, वो हाथ करके छोड़ूंगा, ये दुनिया थूकेगी तुझ पर। बहुत जान है तेरे हाथों में, ये हाथ लगाम पकड़ के घोड़े को बैठा देते। बहुत जान है तेरे हाथों में। याद है ठाकुर क्या कहे थे तुम? ये हाथ नहीं फांसी का फंदा है। फंदा खुल गया, खुल गया फंदा। बहुत जान है हाथों में। ये हाथ हमको दे दे ठाकुर, ये हाथ हमको दे ठाकुर।
about this dialogue that everyone will spit on you. Everyone is going to look at you with this element of feeling sad, and this will be a life that is worse than death. This is something that is used in order to crush his pride, that Gabbar uses as a tool of leading a life with disability, basically means that idea of ostracization and revenge. Now, what does this imply? Basically, the implication of it goes into this understanding of the culture of disableism that has also been reenacted in these cinematic spaces. How a lot of these lived experiences of people with disability also highlight that this melodramatic overtone of cinematic idioms adds to the culture of stigma and prejudices that were already there about people with disability. Now, the similar dialogue on disability in a very different light was curated in a film like Lagan. Now, we look into this association of how the idea of a hero or heroic also comes with this dialogue of disability. But at the same time, when this disability intersects with the caste dialogue, a lot of its characterizations becomes a lot more prominent. Now, does the person with disability need to overcompensate in order to be accepted in the society? These ideas and portrayals often add to how the caste dialogue in India becomes a lot more prominent even within the disability context, as he was called Kachra and Bhuvan in Lagan intervenes in order to bring him into the team to fight against the colonial rule. Now, while we look into these cinematic spaces and the idioms that have been used within to curate the dialogue on caste, his name being addressed as Kachra in itself highlights how the identity of caste overrules and becomes a social disability, wherein the physical disability is capable of taking a backseat. Now, these intersectionalities have also been crafted within Bollywood cinema's portrayal. There is not just one or universal understanding of these portrayals or characterizations within the crafted imagery. This scene from the film Lagan touches upon these ideas of how Kachra had to overcompensate for this aspect of spin bowling in Lagan in a match in order to be recognized and be included. Whereas his disability identity in this regard actually enabled him to come at par and to be included, as he was previously excluded and segregated from the society due to his caste identity.
Over. क्या किया तूने? इधर आ, इधर आ। क्या हो? फिर पकड़ा जी का किन? समझ में नहीं आता। Gracious, the ball's out of its feet. Look, he's on my hat trick.
So as the dialogue was more about how everyone is, or how it's just not a person with disability, but how the close-ups have been used in order to craft this dialogue on disability. In this particular scene, it was prominent that Kachra's identity was now based on evaluated on his performance, and his disability enabled him to get empowered in comparison to how his caste identity had already excluded him from the society. Are the videos audible as well?
Not exactly.
Sorry?
They are audible, but not very clear, Priyam.
Okay.
There is a lot of lag.
I see, I see.
Also, Priyam, just a little request.
Yes.
If you could just give a little more description of the scenes, as
Yes.
it was requested by one of the participants.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
For the scenes that we are showcasing, let's also give a little more description about the scenes. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, okay. So the next film that I would like to bring to all of your notice also is a film that we've been discussing about quite frequently, is Khamoshi. And while it touches upon these aspects of Coda, there is also a pathologizing or a tragic narrative that has been put across with the idea of parenting and disability. So disability parenting was another concept that was put forward in a film like Khamoshi, the musical. Now that itself creates this entire question of how disability parenting adds to this element of self-doubt and also a lot of feeling sorry for a child who was brought up in a household where the parents were disabled. This particular scene is something that I feel really highlights this aspect of tragedy and pathos that has been depicted, wherein Nana Patekar, who plays the role of the father to Annie, is also feeling guilty about the idea of how Annie had to grow up too soon in order to take care and look after her disabled parents. Now, this element has also been portrayed within this cinematic dialogue, wherein he feels that the Prince Charming, who is an able-bodied person, has finally come into Annie's life to take her away from this life of misery. Now, these ideas and identities wherein the culture of disableism has been weaved into the cinematic narrative also adds to how disability and parenting has been associated with tragedy and sadness when it comes to a child born in that family. So as the entire dialogue on the speech of Nana Patekar in the setting is also about how he feels bad that someone like Annie, who is a versatile singer, was born into their family where the wife and the husband, the parents basically, were deaf and dumb. This understanding or curation of dialogue of disability and parenting also adds to this culture of disableism and another lens of viewing disability in itself. Now, when we look into a film like Khamoshi, there is also something which was previously discussed as Coda. Now, Coda is something that's also been something Leonard Davis also has been talking about. How the depiction of Coda in cinematic idioms adds to this culture of viewing disability differently. But how different was something like Khamoshi from Coda? I wouldn't play the trailer here because it shouldn't take up too much time, but I would request all of you to have a look at, to watch Coda and actually try to relate whether a film like Khamoshi that taps into this aspect of Coda and Coda can be looked into differently. How the dialogue on disability, sexuality, and parenting has been brought out. And this also addresses one of the concerns that were raised about caregiving. This aspect of caregiving of the disabled and also the idea of disabled people being the caregiver becomes a lot more complicated in these understandings of Coda. And that is what the cultures of disability and the cultures of studying cinema as a form of portraying disability characterizations and stylizations highlights.
There are plenty of pretty voices with...
So, well, now moving on to the third segment, which is basically the narrative processes. So when we even look into Hindu mythological characterizations and even literary narratives, the idea of disability has been closely intertwined with portraying in need of rectification, the evil or spiteful Shakuni, Kubja, who had a hunched back and therefore would be considered as unattractive, undesirable as a woman. Now, these identities and these cultural underpinnings of disability in mythological characterizations also contributes to how an understanding or an innate perception of disability has already existed within literary discourse. Now, disability representation in these narrative art forms adds to the space of public culture creation, stylization, characterization, and framing within these public cultures such as Bollywood cinema. However, there is not just a universal or a generalized understanding of these disability characterizations. The disguise and the understanding of disability closely intertwines with the need to fit in, the need to overcompensate, mask, or disguise or reduce the visibility of the disability in public settings. Now, these factors essentially contribute towards an internalized systemic form of oppression, inferiority based on the dehumanizing representations, but at the same time, a problem that needs to be resolved. That disability being on the periphery rarely appeared would still be more visible if there is a centrality or a prominent dialogue on disability in literature and cinema. But the other factor that becomes is the add-on of disability in characterizations without essentially navigating any systemic dialogue on the disabled lives or lived experiences of people with disability only adds to a mimicry, or rather an add-on stylistic element of portraying and framing disability stigma. Now, what do these factors essentially contribute about these understandings or the cultures of disability? Does anyone from the audience have an answer to this? What does Bollywood do in order to frame these ideas of disability?
As we talked yesterday, it is the structure which contributes in the representation, such as if the director is able-bodied or disabled, and if the actors fall into the same binary, and if the writer of the story is disabled or an able-bodied and able-minded. So this is what I could think about.
Definitely, definitely. Yes. So that is that element. We basically want to tap into that idea of authenticity in the disability representation. We want to see how much of the lived experience of a person with disability is portrayed on screen, and whether there is any element of relatability with its characterization and framing of the disabled lives. So whether it be in the form of an actor, whether through its writing, whether through a person with disability constantly being in the sets like Malini Chib during Margarita with a Straw. These aspects of disability and its recognition adds to these elements of authenticity that we are trying to even talk about. And these are the factors that inherently contribute towards the understanding of framing of disability in Bollywood cinema as well. So even beyond Bollywood cinema, the prominence of disability in films like Pushpa and Ghajini, which also became massive blockbusters in India and even globally, adds to this dialogue on how disability was crafted within cinematic idioms and eventually also adapted into becoming a Hindi cinema. The reason for doing so was also certain ideas of disability were seen as these stylistic add-ons. Whether they had ideas of authenticity or not was basically not the focus of the narrative, but their look or their appearance or their perception added to this popularization on the crafting of the disability, that how visually they appeared, the use of close-ups on the tattoos or in Ghajini, or even the entire shoulder placement or in Pushpa adds to this element of how the freakish association or the idea of masochistic, very powerful, or the constructed anomaly and the other were added in contributing to this dialogue on disability and sexuality. Now, the looks and appearance also brings me to this entire dialogue on disability stylization. While the dialogue in Ghajini was also about short-term memory loss due to a traumatic event, the entire framing or the view that was provided in Aamir Khan's appearance in Ghajini created quite a buzz. Newspaper articles also outlined how there is more buzz about Aamir's new look. Aamir Khan's new buzz look for Ghajini has been appreciated and talked about a lot. However, very few people know about the designer and all of these factors and also the hairstylist. Now this bald look, the tattoos on the body, the very muscular, right now almost threatening the policemen and anyone around, adds to this element of how the situated other was crafted and the appearance of these star bodies who are seen as these bodies to be emulated, as Richard Dyer says. So these bodies create this interactive space between the fan and the star in creating how one wants to emulate the look and appearance of this disability stylization, which actually became the highlight than the disability itself. So narrative processes becomes this entire bigger dialogue that looks into the social views of disability, the common denominator of the narrative, how these ideas of characterization are portrayed within cinematic idioms, and whether and to what extent should cinema and media become a space of sending more positive images. Because these media images impact people's behavior and understanding of disability. Shakuntala Banerjee, who's a film scholar, actually talks about how these star portrayals on screen, especially in Bollywood cinema, impact and significantly impact people's behavior, especially the younger people's behavior, attitudes, clothing choices, and also add to the trends among the people. Now, when we look into these aspects of portraying how much of the reality, authenticity, and the social realism has been portrayed, then that typically should be taken over by this idea of authentic portrayal and the monstrous oddity of portraying and stylizing, rather the framing of the disability or the disabled body as the star needs to be reduced. So, another factor that it brings forward is going beyond the cultures or ideas of reductionism and segregation, compartmentalization. That a person's identity goes beyond just the disability identity. So is disability seen as a difference, or it is seen as one of the many other identities of an individual, becomes a lot more prominent. Now, these ideas basically make us question of how India, being a country that has so many structural cleavages, multiple identities of an individual, so how do these types of understanding the disability identity become one of the many other identities? Can disability be seen as a difference? And does it enable us to look into the stereotypes and negative imagery without really wanting to emulate them? So can we question and look at how the images of disability that are portrayed as threatening, freakish, pitiable, individual in isolation, the excessive portrayal, and the dramatization effects, can they be seen as only these frames of reference and not emulated as it is? So it makes us question how disability is drawn upon as a symbolic figure. But at the same time, this disability portrayed within media cultures has its own social and political dimensions. Now, when we look into a film like Golmaal, there was also disability characterization, wherein you see that how the performance of Black was reenacted and crafted within a comic imagery, wherein the idea of blindness was seen as faking or masking it in order to threaten the other person. Now, this comedy element that was added to disability also highlights how disability and its portrayal is constantly wired with this comic interludes or seen as the comic relief component of a film. While one would say a lot of directors have constantly said that this film is a no-brainer, one goes there just for laughs. But the idea of disability characterization being put as the central of the laughing stock characterization adds to this question of why the disability portrayal was made as the subject of fun and the banter. This particular scene of Golmaal is basically Ajay Devgan performing blind in order to stay in the particular house which they have entered, and now they feel that the two people living whose house it is are blind people, so they can fool them and stay in that house. But in this particular scene, he uses the trick of showing that he is blind in order to slap the other visitor in the house.
भाई जी, मैं विकी भाई कॉलेज का डीन हूँ, मुझे सोमनाथ जी से मिलना है। अच्छा अच्छा, तू कभी सोमनाथ जी से मिला है? जी नहीं, मैंने उन्हें कभी नहीं देखा, सिर्फ तारीफ सुनी है उनकी। मैं ही सोमनाथ हूँ, बोल। अच्छा आप हैं? लेकिन अभी अभी एक लड़के ने कहा कि आप मंदिर गए हुए हैं। वो मेरा नौकर है, मंदिर ही जा रहा था, वाइफ की टूटी हुई चप्पल टूट गई तो लौट आया। आपसे मिलके मैं बहुत धन्य हो गया। आप बंधे हैं? क्या कर लेगा बे? कुछ नहीं, ये सुन के बड़ा दुख हुआ मुझे। आपकी तारीफ बहुत सुनी है मैंने, बहुत तारीफ सुनी है। आप एयरफोर्स में थे, फिर
So this aspect of how the visitor also addresses that आप अंधे हैं, आपकी बहुत तारीफ सुनी है हमने, बहुत सुन के बहुत दुख हुआ. This element of tragedy associated with disability characterization and its performance, although in this it is fake disability portrayal, the idea of how these crafted comic interludes are weaved into cinematic idioms adds to how idiosyncrasies, quirks, and these ideas of banter and laughter are always made a couple of times made at the cost of disability portrayals. Now, the same goes with this entire performance of disability in Chup Chup, where the idea of Jabba Jabba, which is something that Shahid Kapoor constantly keeps saying, in order to feel that in order to be pitied and therefore the others feel bad for him and look after him, in this entire sorry state, added to this entire dialogue on how the person with disability is subjected to pity. Even the last scene of the film, Chup Chup Ke, highlights this entire element of how the person with disability is bechara, and even the girl with disability is seen as someone who needs to be married off to a person with a disability in order for that person to not abuse her. Now, these understandings of how disability is subjected to pity, viewed as the bechara, seen as difficult to be married to, are very common prototypes that have been circulated within Bollywood cinema. And now this crafted understanding of how performing disability so that one is not subjected to work and also subjected to pity, the pathos, and therefore always offered food and not expected to work, adds to this entire exclusionary matrix of portraying disability on screen. Now, this scene also in Chup Chup Ke, basically gives you a crux of how the disabled person is also seen as someone who has, although portraying speech disability, is being shown as someone who can be easily fooled into any of these tasks and possibly given less milk in his tea, less tea, or also seen as, oh, this poor little thing needs to be given food in order to be as a comic component. Now, while we look into these understandings of faking disability in Bollywood cinema, a lot of its characterization also focuses on how disability becomes another aspect of in need to be cured and therefore can be an element of getting a lot of money. Now, while we look into the crafting of disability within narratives in Bollywood cinema itself, there is a lot of dialogue on how there are multiple images that circulate about wherein certain disability characterizations have framed the sensitivity and sensitized audiences about disability and sexuality, whereas a lot of them have made it as a passing remark within its characterizations of disability itself. So now essentially another factor, what makes Bollywood unique? Anyone from the audience? What makes Bollywood unique?
It's music and dance numbers.
Great. Yes. So anyone else? I think Bhakti, you raised your hand.
Yes, I was about to say the same thing. Musical, like Bollywood movies are called Bollywood musicals. Apart from like people outside India call them Bollywood musicals rather than just Bollywood movies.
Yes, definitely. So another factor that apart from maybe the comedy, the idea of entertainment, the melodramatic overtones, but what is essentially the global identity of Bollywood cinema becomes the Bollywood musical. The song picturization, the dance choreo musicological elements, the use of foreign locations, the idea of exoticism, voyeuristic frames for reference. So these factors essentially contribute to the Bollywood culture. So songs in a way, or the song and dance idioms in a way, communicate this dialogue on disability as well. They essentially take the narrative forward, or they basically have a gist of the entire cinematic dialogue and space. They add to the heterosexual romance component, and they also emote the whatever the author's the director's vision is through the framing and stylization of its characters and its dancing bodies. So this star-fan interaction in a way globally happens in Bollywood cinema also through its song and dance cultures. And so is the performance of disability in it. So a film like Lafange Parande also taps into these sentimentalities. On one hand, Rachel Dwyer also describes song and dance as interruptions. There are also other cinema studies scholars who've seen it as a medium of taking the narrative forward in a faster fashion. But on the other hand, the absence of songs can also create another culture in itself. Now, I'll talk about the absences in a while, but I would like to probably notice Nain Parinde, which in itself, a song from Lafange Parinde, talks about how the machistic person, the hero, which is Neel Nitin Mukesh, is basically now trying to compensate by dancing and performing, and is this soon idea of the girl, Pinky, who becomes disabled due to an accident that Neel Nitin Mukesh was involved in, adds to this element of how he feels guilty and responsible for her to now come back to life and looks at her pitifully. Suddenly, this blurring divide of romance, love, and pity becomes an entire complex situation wherein he looks at her, he views her helplessly, but at the same time is constantly following her in order to ensure her safety. Now, this song also, in a way, communicates and emotes these ideas of how this element of tragedy, pathos, is now intrinsically woven into Pinky's life. That the entire Nain Parinde, Badle Jo Nain, basically highlights this entire dialogue where Neel Nitin Mukesh tries to redeem himself in order to help her out by constantly walking behind her as she cannot see. And these ideas of disability as a need of help, as a medium of redemption for the sins that you do, was also another underlying thought behind the crafting of this characterization and even the song in particular. So these songs also play a very intrinsic role in crafting the narrative and also popularizing Bollywood cinema and the ways it mediates one to think of disability and the cultures of disableism. Now, at the same time, a film like Barfi had multiple elements of portraying disability. They tapped into autism. They also tapped into deaf and mute characterization. But at the same time, it highlighted ideas of stylization, clothing, and disability romance. Now, that was not something very common, although there were films like Koshish, but there are the prominence of the disability through its stylization and this entire dialogue on how hum banaye aashiyan, which is we create a world of ours which is separate or different from this entire ableist imaginary, highlighted these aspects of how this element of disability adds to a constructivism of the situated other. Now, I'll play this video for just a short while so that you can get a clue. But the basic gist of the song is that it crafts this idea of how disability is these elements of quirks and idiosyncrasies that come forward, and also an infantilized, relatively infantilized characterization through the stylization of clothing. About basically the song Aashiyan talks about these aspects of how only small happinesses or these ideas of small pleasures can make us very happy in a world of our own, which is also very excluded from the entire larger periphery. If you see that by now they are teachers in a special school, and also the portrayal and characterization of disability romance holds a very intrinsic role in this portrayal of how they are the situated other within these normative formats, which is also being depicted within its song and dance cultures. Now, this dialogue on disability and sexuality was something that did come into play in a film like Black, where the use of colors, framing, tonality, and most importantly, what we discussed about, the songs play a pivotal role. Now, why would I say a film like Black holds prominence? So Tejaswini Ganti, who's a film scholar, states that the culture of songlessness is rather rare within cinemas. It is always done with an intent, and the absence of it is also got another intent which serves some particular reasoning. Now, film like Black typically foregrounds these elements of how cultures of disableism, wherein the life of Michelle that we've been talking about since our first session as well, of her being deaf and blind, saying that her life is doomed in this element of being black, highlights these ideas a lot more through the use of background sound, the tonality of frames, the absence of colors and stylization of characters in that frame, and also the dancing body characterization within the backdrop of an ableist situation. Now, her dancing in the snow also was this entire anomaly characterization wherein she was dancing, but there was no real song playing. There was certain rising crescendo of music tones that actually enabled her to again become the constructed anomaly within these portrayals of disability. Now, while you see an entire framing of how Amitabh Bachchan and Rani Mukherjee act in black, this performance of disability and how their sense of feel and touch plays a pivotal role has been enabled primarily through this rising crescendo of the background score and the songlessness, which is obviously intended in this idiom in order to add to this culture of dissonance, rather the sexual dissonance. So you see that the day Michelle receives her degree, she comes to visit her teacher, Debraj. And the use of close-ups actually enable this entire cinematic dialogue on their disability now, and who is more disabled within this space and temporality of showing the culture of disableism. While the absence of any other color and the lack of song and dance elements within the characterizations add to this culture of heightening the anxiety or vulnerability while portraying the dialogue on disability and sexuality. While Debraj walks around Michelle in order to feel her gown after coming back after receiving her degree for which they spent years, both of them keep crying at the sight of what has just happened. So these ideas or cultures that are created through the absences of songs also, in a way, add to this dialogue of how the constructivism of disability and sexuality has been crafted within cinematic language. But at the same time, it makes one ponder about how the formulaic heterosexual romantic interludes have always made it quintessential for a film success to be banking on the ability to entertain its audiences through its song and dance cultures. And the absence of something like this in a film like Black adds to this entire troubling dialogue on what was the intent of positioning disability characterization in this particular light. Obviously, there were a lot more shades within this dialogue on sexuality as well, where there was a monologue wherein she says how she may never feel the loving touch of a man, adds to this entire sense of sexual dissonance and also a sense of feeling the doubt of sexual self-esteem. So moving on to the very specifics of Bollywood portrayals of women with disabilities. Meenu Bhambani basically talks about how this overarching generalization of male gaze has always posited this entire voyeuristic frame of reference for the male dominant audiences being the most active engagement in cinematic idioms. Now, while we look into the male gaze, something that as a term was coined by Laura Mulvey states that women are always subjected to this exhibitionist gaze by its largely dominant male audiences. So the absence of which typically means that the consideration of being seen as desirable, beautiful, marriageable, or capable of being a mother is also stripped off. But when we look into the Bollywood portrayals of women with disability, this absence dialogue on male gaze adds to this entire troubling sense of how we situate the disabled woman within it. Now, the male gaze in this case is also replaced with a stare. The ideas of desirability, beauty, and someone who's considered as marriageable are closely intertwined with these ideas of able-bodiedness and also the absence of disability. Now, the coming in of these two adds to how a woman with disability is viewed as incapable of being considered as marriageable, not considered as desirable, and incapable of performing motherhood. Now, these are the glorified prototypes within cinematic representations. And Rosemary Garland Thompson argues that the staring as a concept is also this entire biopolitics of power. The power operates in such a way that the person with disability is stripped of the elements of being gazed at and instead seen as a subject to be stared at. Now, the idea of staring itself exerts its idea of agency being put upon the person who's subjected to the stare. So the staring person has way more power than the person being stared at. And the one being stared at is usually due to these freakish associations, the anomaly characterizations, and this constructivism of the ideal or the norm typecasted. So while we take this argument forward, disability and the marriage question has also been very prominent even when it comes to the entire dialogue on the marriage question of men with disability. A film like Sarjan also put forward this dialogue on how the disability identity is seen as overpowering in a lot of situations, wherein the ideas of sexual self-worth and the lowered sexual self-esteem are inherently portrayed as the norm. Now, at the same time, someone like Gogol, as called in Shubh Mangal Zyada Savdhan, was shown as this unfit bride, as someone, because she has an eye that was injured, is being portrayed as for whom it's very difficult to find a groom. That's why she needs to comply with the idea of leading a life in loneliness, or else marrying a man who already has 3 sons who are closer to her age. Even a film like Man in 1992 tapped into these ideas of guilt, shame, and lowered sexual self-worth upon acquiring a disability upon an accident. And this is something that Meenu Bhambani also argues about. Now, while we look into this transition from being an able-bodied person to also in the climax scene where Manisha Koirala mentions that she was scared of showing that she has a disability and therefore that would ruin the life of Amir Khan, is also another typically prominent characterization of how the association of a disabled woman is portrayed as someone who is feeling very inferior on acquiring a disability and therefore feels she's incapable of performing wifehood and subsequently motherhood. But at the same time, Amir Khan's characterization as someone who becomes heroic in wanting to marry a woman with disability adds to this typical prominence of how the idea of heroism is associated with one willing to go past a woman's disability. Now I'll play the last scene. So these ideas or understandings have also been communicated through this use of melodramatic overtones with the entire background score that adds to this entire melodrama sequence on how the revelation of be acquiring a disability is communicated, but at the same time how Manisha Koirala feels inferior upon stating, and she does not explicitly state that she has acquired a disability. So I'll move on to the last frame also, which is basically the entire marriage sequence where he decides to. So even films like Judai, also on a very side note, tapped into how these aspects of disability have highlighted the certain dialogues and snippets like ऊपर वाले इसके टेप रिकॉर्डर में प्ले का बटन डालना भूल गया था तू. So these ideas were also typically portrayed within Bollywood cinema, which may not have been the central theme of the entire film, but have also tapped into these emotions of showing the women's disability as a misfit, or rather people being tricked into marrying these women with disabilities. So the sexual culture of disabled people actually tries to look into how there is always an inherently preference for an able-bodied partner within these constructs of marriage, motherhood, and also an assumption of how the sexual perversion or sex is equated to the idea of reproduction. So the societal parameters of a person's ability adds to creating this culture of disability, wherein the disability is considered as a clinical matter. Now, this complicates the very idea of privacy and also the concepts of caregiving and confinement within institutions and private spaces, therefore making disability as something to be hidden. Even Black in this way crafted this entire dialogue of isolation, alienation, and sexual disillusionment, eventually making the teacher and the student kiss. So as the teacher also states that you, Michelle, may not really feel the loving touch of a man. These elements of portraying the culture of disableism have always produced this complex idea of embodiment. The underlying and explicit restrictions on the ideas of sexual citizenship therefore adds to this taboo and stigmatized discussion. And these questions basically bring you back to how the ideas of access stay as dominant concepts within disability representation, and also fear, worthlessness, the construct of an abject or the anomaly, ideas of shame, embarrassment, and the subjected vulnerability portrays these ideas of disability and sexuality that have been weaved into Bollywood cinema's crafting. And Sargent too looked into this typecasting and classification of disabled masculinity. Through its introductory scenes itself, you see how the overarching generalization of disability being the dominant identity becomes very prominent. And it also complicates this entire understanding of masculinity itself, because masculinity in one way is always associated on the hegemonic constructs of virility, power, assertion, and the prominence of patriarchy. Now, this first scene itself, wherein Sanjay Dutt is introduced as a child who has polio, also highlights this element of how a narrative weaves in the tragedy and pathos in portraying the culture of disableism. Now, this scene also captures these emotions where the idea of dust in the entire field, wherein Sanjay Dutt is walking as a child, highlights these ideas with the entire voiceover that's done for him.
यूं तो जिंदगी के सफर में कई आंधी और तूफानों का सामना करना पड़ता है, लेकिन इस मासूम और अनाथ बच्चे की जिंदगी में एक तूफान और भी है, और वो तूफान है इसकी मजबूरी, लाचारी और अकेलेपन का एहसास। अमन,
फादर,
बेटे तुम यहाँ अकेले क्या कर रहे हो?
फादर, सब बच्चों से मिलने या उन्हें लेने कोई ना कोई जरूर आता है, लेकिन मुझसे मिलने या लेने कोई नहीं आता। क्यों? क्या मेरे दुनिया में कोई भी नहीं है?
है ना बच्चन, जिसका इस दुनिया में कोई नहीं होता ना, उसका वो होता है।
So as you see, the entire culture of disableism as a child's whole suppressed identity was shown as the entire idea of isolation, loneliness was portrayed by saying that you are a child of God. So even if no one comes to visit you, you could be an orphan, but the idea of being lachar, lonely, is associated with the disability identity in itself. So Alison Caffer basically talks about this problems of defining disability, how this understanding of disability is also complicated with understandings of chronic illnesses, the visible and invisible disability divide, the feminist critique and the pedagogies involved in looking at disability itself, and disability as something that's seen as to be cured, a loss or disavowal. So this normalization of heterosexuality adds to how can the queer disability dialogue even exist. Now, Sadma also, in a way, frames this entire dialogue where this transition from being an able-bodied woman to being a woman with a mental disability adds to how the dream sequence was curated in the form of her again becoming an able-bodied woman. It is this dialogue that Alison Caffer talks about, that this prominence of disability as in need of cure to be rectified is very prominent in these portrayals of dream sequences in Bollywood cinema, such as in Sadma. So I would skip the video because of the lack of time, but if we possibly have time later, we can get back to it. The entire depiction of how the infantilization in the portrayal of Sri Devi in Sadma curates this dialogue on disability and sexuality, wherein the infantilization holds a very prominent role within the picturization of disability itself. So it is this cripping phenomenon, or rather the super crip phenomenon, that's been portrayed, and the queerness and disability dialogue that comes into play, whereas both of them actually come into highlighting how this is a medical problem. Now, these performances of sexuality are also dependent on how the presumptions or attitudes about disability and sexualities exist in the society. The assumption of the person with disability being an asexual or being a hypersexual being therefore adds to this culture of disableism, wherein disability is seen as someone who would be lonely. So the heterosexism and the homophobia constructs this deviance curation, with the queer being even worse identity than being the disabled person. So the resistance and lack of recognition of these sexual experiences in media representations adds to this dialogue on how body becomes a space of contestation and what becomes more prominent. So in one case we saw in a film like Lagan, there was the overpowering caste identity over the disability identity. Similar now, in this case, when we look into the queer dialogue, the queer identity is more stigmatized than the disability identity. In a film like Margarita with a Straw also, when Leila decides to come out to her mother and state that she is queer and she's bisexual, she has a girlfriend, the first reaction by her mother was chi, and a word that is usually expressed in showing disgust. Now, these aspects of sexual dissonance and also the dialogue on sexuality and queering Bollywood becoming a lot more prominent in the diasporic setting added to how this dialogue on sexuality is very uncommon within Indian familial households. And Bollywood also, such as Margarita with a Straw, in a way crafted this dialogue on how this dialogue on sexuality needs to be expressed, and how queering Bollywood and queering Bollywood with disability adds to these multiple layers of unpacking. So disability in the passing is also another construct of viewing and perceiving disability. So what are these ideas of desirability? Can anyone answer? What are the constructs of desirability? Yes, sorry.
It can be related to the color, to caste, to class, to the height of the person, to the standard construction and notion of beauty, to person being able-bodied and or disabled bodied, and the type of disability he, she, or they suffers from. Let us say it is an invisible disability, such as a neurological disorder, and it is completely invisible. Even the family is not capable to understand. The doctors are able-bodied. So in those cases, when the layers keep on adding, it becomes complex, and the person is not sure that he, she, or they are desired. And if they are, there is hesitance and a lot of other factors. I'll stop here.
Okay, definitely, yes. So that there are multiple factors. It's not just about the disability, but also about the type of disability. Then there are factors on the looks, on the caste, and various other factors that come into play. The degree and variation of the disability itself, the prominence of the disability. So within this dialogue on constructing desirability, how do we situate disability characterization, stylization, and narratology? And what makes disability, its passing comments, and ideation different? So disability has also been a very prominent theme within a lot of multiple identities, wherein it's been faked, it's been in a construct or a passing remark as in a cinema. So even a film like Sultan had a dialogue like, शाहरुख खान का मजाक मत उड़ाओ, मन्ने बहुत पसंद है, जब वो लड़की के आंख में आंख डाल के देखना तो अंधी लड़की भी पट जावे. Now, when one wants to curate or craft a dialogue in which you want to add an element of banter or quirkiness, a lot of these passing remarks have been made within mainstream cinema itself, which has not been a disability-centered narrative. But whether it is constructed an idea of desirability or an ideal has also been geared within the conversation. Also, disability is subjected to this element of comedy narration. So in Houseful 3, there was a dialogue, love is blind, but in my case, the lover is blind. ए भाई, छुट्टा नहीं है, इधर भीख नहीं मांगना, upon seeing a man on a wheelchair. Now, these associational frameworks is what Atanu Mohapatra also talks about in stating that when we look at characterizations of disability, there are a lot of these polar opposite characterizations, wherein the disability is associated with being the helpless mother on a wheelchair, the beggar who is seen as hopeless, and also the comic relief component of the narration itself. So whether we can really say that there is only one umbrella bracketing becomes slightly problematic, because these constructs of desirability and portrayal of disability also adds to this entire dialogue on how it is crafted within the cinema. While we saw a video in our first session of how the address of progeria was being made within disability in PA, there is also Houseful 3, where the idea of disability has been curated in split personality disorder has been shown on screen to add to the humorous component in the film itself. So this is a scene from the film Houseful 3 that depicts this entire comic undertone in order to underline this culture of disableism, but at the same time, how it does not give a very clear indication of the way a disability is to be approached and explained.
Sandy.
क्या हुआ?
You're suffering from split personality disorder.
Split?
It's a relatively rare disorder, जहाँ पे कभी depression की वजह से तो कभी फाइनेंशियल प्रेशर्स यानी पैसों की वजह से इंसान के अंदर से एक और पर्सनालिटी बाहर आ जाती है, एक और इंसान बाहर आ जाता है. And in your case, it's DID.
Dance India dance.
Dissociative Identity Disorder.
वो क्या है?
चलो बाहर लटकते हैं.
लटकते हैं?
Let's hang out. तुम्हारा केस स्टडी करने के बाद ये वर्ड INDIAN तुम्हें अवॉइड करना होगा. ये वर्ड सुनते ही सुंडी तुम्हारी जगह ले लेगा. Because all your life you've been bullied because of your race and color.
मतलब?
I'm sorry.
ये एक वर्ड सुनते ही, how is this possible?
It is possible, Sandy. How do I explain it to you now? Sandy.
मेरा तो सर फटा जा रहा है. Want someone to get me a black tea?
Sure. Sandy! जैसे वर्ड सुन के तुम सुनने बन जाते हो वैसे ही ये ब्लैक सुन के. Nurse!
Wait. I'm saying wait.
So these ideas of how this entire comic imagery or like the entire sequel is created on showing split personality disorder in a film like Houseful 3 also adds to this other dimension of viewing disability. So Bollywood has crafted these very different dialogues and perceptions of how disability is to be perceived. And even with films like Golmaal, you see multiple dimensions on how these elements have been portrayed. Even Hera Fairy had these passing remarks on disability characterizations and this, the entire dialogue on how disability is to be laughed at. So when we look at these ideas and cultures, we can basically see the entire framework of how this public culture, which is Bollywood cinema, is curated based on multiple factors, which are the audience demands, which is the market demands, the ideological praxis of the audience, and its engagement with the cinematic idioms. The cinema as a dimension becomes this tool that is therefore wired and made by the filmmaker's vision. So the filmmaker crafts the cinema that the audience consumes, and therefore it is an ideology that is produced in becoming a public culture that is internalized, perceived, and therefore performed. So now opening the floor for questions.
You may raise your hands or type your question in the chat box. I will read it out for Priyam.
There is
Hello,
one question. Yes, sorry.
Yeah, am I audible, ma'am?
Yes.
Yes, ma'am. As you talked about various disabilities in movies, ma'am, I want to refer you to those movies when we see that the actor wants to attract a girl. So he became disabled. He was acting like disabled, like a movie Badshah and Kyunki Main Jhoot Nahi Bolta in Govinda. And I have seen a movie Deewane Hue Pagal, where we see a heroine's brother was disabled, and the main actor sees that yes, the girl was means very affectionate with his brother, and he is very caring. And in the whole movie we see that characters who are not disabled, but they are making themselves disabled, like Asrani and Sunil Shetty, and one more character who became disabled in front of that girl to attract him. So what is your opinion to means avoid these playing with disabilities?
Thank you so much, Abhay, for that question. So that is something that I would also like to discuss about, and that's something due to time, I couldn't tap into that aspect and prominence of narratives as well. So that is another segment wherein you have the faking disability aspect. the disability where you want to attract a sense of being loved, pity, and therefore to be taken care of. And these aspects are very prominent in the films you mentioned. Even a film like Chup Chup Ke actually essentially points to that element only, where you feel a sense of, oh, this is a bechari, and in the end, that Kareena Kapoor is the one whom Shahid Kapoor chooses to marry, because that poor girl will not find another groom who'd be willing to marry her. So these aspects, and even the woman, the other woman in that scene, being okay to let go because it's a disabled woman who may never find a partner. And the faking disability aspect in order to get the attention becomes a lot more prominent, because there was one scene where Govinda also cuts off his tongue in order for Rani Mukherjee to love him, because that's how she knew him, as a person with disability who needed help. So a lot of these scenes become prominent in how the idea of caregiving is complicated with the association of love and romance, and shown as a way of how the person with disability fakes a disability to get attention, and then eventually is masquerading it in order to be still loved.
Yes, ma'am. And we have also seen movie Welcome Back, where we find Don, wanted by Nasiruddin Shah, was acting as a visually impaired villain. But on the other side, we have seen his lackings and his attitude towards the society and towards the opposite genders. It was also making fun of disability, ma'am. That I didn't consider it should be picturized like this.
Yes, definitely. So these are a couple of these scenes that I have in terms of framing of how disability comedy and the idea of how disability is subjected to the jokes. So even something like Golmaal, Welcome, they bring upon these elements of how the disability becomes the subject of jokes and is also seen as a penalization in a way. So the disabled character is being ridiculed for their disability, and at the same time, they always are shown as the outlier within the frame of reference itself.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you.
Ria, I think, wants to ask a question. Ria, you may unmute yourself.
Yes. Hello, Priyam. Great session. I think some of these movies were the movies which we used to enjoy in our childhood, but these perspectives and conferences and workshops like this actually make us think more. So thank you for that. I just wanted to know that you mentioned, you talked in great detail about women and disabilities and their sexualities, where we talked about Sajan and Shubh Mangal Zada Savdan, in specific related to the disability and marriage question. I also want to know that there's I won't say a new emerging field, but since you have mentioned Garland's work, I read her work title as Feminist Disability Studies, and in one of the chapters she also one scholar talks about fat studies. So we have other movies like in Bala, there's a girl who's fat, right? And there's another movie, there are a lot of movie, I think Dam Laga Ke Haisha and all these movies. So do you also think that the representations like these in Bollywood are also extending the umbrella term of disability? Can that be included, or is it a far-stretched idea? Because in India we are still struggling to have a proper representation, as we have been discussing through this. So just wanted to know your opinion on this. Thank you.
Yes. So thank you very much, Ria. So basically that does tap into multiple shades of actually viewing what we would define disability as. And as I also said, that in terms of even the caste dialogue in something like Kachra's characterization in Lagan was about caste being more prominent of a disability, rather a social disability. And the similar logic also applies to something like Dam Laga Ke Haisha, where there is Bhumi Pednekar's character who is ostracized, shamed by her husband. And at the same time, there is a husband who's feeling very um, less masculine, rather unmanly, because he is not the breadwinner in the house. So these ideas become very brewing because now they are increasingly being discussed. It's not that they were not portrayed within Bollywood cinema before, but a lot of these discussions are becoming prominent in cinematic discourse to unpack the concepts of what is the framing of disability, whether we are viewing disability as only a physical disability, or are we seeing it as a social barrier that comes in the way of attaining capabilities that make you feel empowered, independent, and as much as a human like anyone else. So this sense of feeling the lowered sexual self-esteem sprouts into multiple identities that one possibly has within Indian settings and within Indian households.
Thank you so much for answering the question.
Ananya?
Hi, am I audible?
Yes, yes.
Thank you very much, Priyam, for this very insightful, because I remember watching these films long time back, but today I think I relook them. At least I have been able to unlearn, certain things that we accepted and never questioned. So thank you so much for opening this entire field up. And I was, I had, I remember Om Shanti Om, a particular scene in Om Shanti Om where Shah Rukh plays the role of this disabled man. At least the director wants him to be disabled. And when he says that this film is not going to do well because your hero can't do so many things. I mean, how can he be called a hero? So my question was that when he decides to introduce this Dard Bhara disco, and there is this entire sequence of this, very stylized presentation of the song. So when a superstar, takes upon, I'm not saying that all superstars need to be very, very responsible towards all, social concerns or even humanistic concerns. But what impression do you think the audience members are going to receive? Because this entire sequence is so fresh on my mind, and I always wanted to ask somebody to, let me understand it a bit more. Thank you.
Definitely. So, Ananya,
he says, "Haath pav nahi jisko kaise karega disco." That's the dialogue before the song comes.
Yes.
So that dialogue and even the entire mention that you just said about how does the star performance and the kind of ideology that they want to sell, what element of sensitization do we even expect on their behalf? So what becomes prominent is the star body is an embodiment of even the nation's preoccupations. A lot of times what we see a star body perform is basically the audience and the market demand is such. The reason why stars are willing to take on roles of performing these disabilities and multiple disabilities now on screen is because there is a tendency of winning awards based on showing their versatility of acting on screen. Whether that acting is geared towards generating sensitization, or whether they celebrate the body of having six-pack abs and doing a darde disco. They themselves are seen as these physical transformations of performing on screen because they are embodying these preoccupations that they want to sell in the form of the Bollywood industry in itself. Now, while there was Om Shanti Om, where Shah Rukh Khan did address this concern and have the entire Darde disco after stating how the idea of a hero is. There was also an element where he tried to state that there is a prominent sense of sensitization he has for disabled audiences when he wanted to market his film, My Name is Khan. So those stances or like the approaches of how they want to sell their star body through what kind of dialogues they want to curate in the film itself keeps changing based on what the film content really is. So during Om Shanti Om, he did not want to market it in a way that disability comes into the limelight, but more about how his body went through a transformation in having the six-pack abs and doing a Darde Disco dance performance became the highlight.
Thank you so much. Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Chaitanya?
Good evening. So I wanted to know your opinion about, like, we talked about that disabled are often portrayed as as not sexually attractive in movies. So, and nobody wants to be in relationship with them. So my question is, like, in a movie like Zero, where Shah Rukh Khan and Anushka Sharma were both disabled and were both attracted to each other. So what do you have to say about these kind of relationship where disabled get attracted towards each other? Yeah.
Okay, very interesting question, because when you did mention about the film Zero, at the same time, there was a sense of Shah Rukh Khan coming to terms with not necessarily finding Anushka Sharma attractive, but coming to terms with how he would have to find a woman with disability, because his own disability leaves him in a vulnerable situation of not having found anyone. But at the same time, when he did get the attention from Katrina Kaif, he abandoned Anushka Sharma with a desire of thinking he can do better. And these ideas were also prominent in something like, so every narrative does not necessarily indicate the abandonment or the disabled person being considered as less desirable and therefore left around. But also they provide this lens of viewing how the desire is to find an able-bodied partner attractive, and the absence of finding one like that leads you to come to terms with if you might have to be okay with a disabled partner.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Deb Kumar? Okay, if not, then Shomnath, you have a question?
Hi, good evening.
Good evening.
So basically, it's a question a little out of the Bollywood periphery. So there's this series called Vikings that is available on Netflix, and it has a very interesting character, Ivar the Boneless, who is the son of Ragnar Lothbrok, right? So when we see the character of Ivar the Boneless as it has been portrayed in Vikings, due to his certain condition, there are these dialogues by the other characters that surround him, which talk a lot about the understanding of sexuality and masculinity, and also his situation in an ableist culture of then Norway. So I'd like to know your views on the same.
Okay. So I'm sorry I've not watched this Netflix series, but I would definitely love to do that and probably discuss this with you when I do. So I've noted it down. But I feel like, so right now with Netflix actually being another space of introducing a lot of dialogue on sexuality, this actually reminds me of something that one of the directors whom I interviewed, Akash Khurana, he stated that, and he's largely been with the OTT and Netflix films. He stated that with now cinema being a space that is also something viewed on the OTT through Netflix, it gives a lot of creative space for dialogue on these sexualities, marginalized sexualities that could previously not been done, because cinema was always a movie watching or activity for a family. So only something, or with friends. So only something that was socially acceptable could be gone and viewed in the theaters because it was to be catering to all age groups and all of that. Now it has become an isolated event too. And viewing things like that discuss sexuality blatantly becomes a lot more easier when you can do it in isolation without having to tell anyone. So that's a very interesting note that I feel that comes into play when a lot of these Netflix and OTT cultures come into drawing upon the life of be it a disability, be it a queering Bollywood culture. These ideas and dialogues on sexual repression, sexual disillusionment become very evident in these spaces. And once I do watch this film, then I'll definitely have a discussion with you on this. But sorry for now, I've not watched it, but what I could gather, I thought this is something that does answer a little bit of your question of this changing pattern.
Yes, thank you so much.
Thank you. Dev Kumar? Okay. Sanskriti Sanghi?
Yes. Hi, Priyam. Thank you very much for the session. So I have two questions, perhaps related, perhaps not. So the first question is, as we discussed earlier today, sex education is a taboo topic in India because sex itself is taboo. And because of that, it can be extremely limited both in the familial space and in the institutional space. And even if it's sort of delivered, it's not necessarily oriented towards pleasure the way that desire as a frame of reference would want us to think about. And so the question comes perhaps from a recent case study where this empirical data reported that even within the sex education that is delivered, the focus on persons with disabilities is further limited. So against such a backdrop, when films which have mass appeal portray desire towards a person of disability, it really becomes a frame of reference. And I find it a little problematic that many of the mainstream Bollywood films think of these narratives as deviance, heroism, impossibility, and pity, even in the way we discussed today. So the first question is, how can the field of film studies and disability studies urge resistance against such narratives and provide them a similar mass appeal, which is the larger question, because we want these narratives to reach out. And the second question is much shorter. If you watch the show Sex Education on Netflix, it's dealing with sexuality, but also disability in a fairly sensitive manner. And the show seems to have an educational quality alongside entertainment. So I haven't come across this, but have you come across any examples from film, theater, or literature within the Indian landscape that do a similar role for the Indian audience? Yeah, thank you so much.
Okay. So thank you very much. A very interesting point, and also very nice observations also. So obviously, sex education was something that tapped into multiple layers, especially because it had the youth-centric content, and it tapped into a lot of its youth-centric dilemmas in a way of addressing disability too, without really adding to the outlier status in every narrative. The problematics of why actors want to perform disability on screen is also because the idea of a film being marketed is based on how novel the curation and crafting of the content is. And that is again based on the writing and the directorial vision. So the stars are willing to take on the roles as long as the disability has a story that adds to their versatility as an actor, which itself becomes more like looking at it as a market rather than a sensitization medium. Whether we think there is something equivalent to what sex education really did, I felt that something like Jalsa, very recently, that was released on Amazon Prime, still crafted the identity of having a disabled protagonist perform the disability yet the entire narrative not being geared towards a child with disability. It was on the performances of caregiving, the fear, and was still a thriller, yet not taking away completely from the disability angle of caregiving. Whether there are similar dialogues that have been weaved within Bollywood cinema, something that we can see as an adaptation also was Omkara. The character of Iago being adapted into playing Langda Tyagi also put forward a caste dialogue within Bollywood cinema. And at this point, although he was constantly called Langda Tyagi through the narrative itself in Omkara, the characterization did not curate an entire dialogue on just the disability identity. It portrayed the problematics of caste in India. And that itself can be very telling in terms of the directorial or the script writing vision. Because one, we are trying to adapt something that was already very popularized as Shakespeare's play. But at the same time, we are trying to put in an Indian version to it with a flavor of Indianness. And that adds a dialogue of viewing disability not being a central identity. Now, in that pattern, there are a couple of films that may or may not have touched upon the sensitivity of the disability itself. But even the crafting of the disability and the accessibility question in a series like Mismatched on Netflix added to a dialogue that a lot of people with disability whom I interviewed during my study also stated that this question of accessibility, frustration, and the ideas of how there are presumptions made based on people with disability itself was somehow weaved into the narrative through Anmol's character in Mismatched. So these are certain examples that really come to my mind, but I would love to share some more, maybe in the Indian context too later.